My name is Qin Kang, Associate Professor here at the Department of Philosophy at Zhenji University. So I am very happy to have the honor to chair this session. So welcome to the second lecture in the lecture series with Professor David Hall, and entitled "Live the Religion." So on Monday afternoon, Professor Hall already gave a very lucid and very insightful, illuminating lecture about the relation between church and state in the United States all the way back to the 17th, 18th century and to contemporary situation. And today, the topic will be "Live the Religion" and overview, where Professor Hall will enlighten about his most important contribution to the study of religion in recent decades, namely the craft or invention of this term, "live the religion." And just to anticipate, tomorrow afternoon at the Institute of Sociological Study at the Academia Sinica, from 2:30 to 4:30, Professor Hall will deliver his third and last lecture entitled "Live the Religion Through Case Studies." So all are welcome to join tomorrow's lecture. And this afternoon, from 2 to 4, Professor Tsai will chair another roundtable discussion with 4 panelists from local and from the U.S., Professor Justin Rissinger, to talk about their own studies that's relevant to the notion of live the religion. And we are very thrilled to have Professor David Hall to kindly respond to their thoughts and observations. So, but before today's lecture, let me briefly introduce again to you. Maybe some of you, or most of you already know Professor Hall, but let me just briefly introduce him to you again. Professor Hall got his Bachelor of Arts degree from Harvard College, and then his PhD from Yale University. And he taught first at Yale and then Boston University, and then starting teaching at Harvard Divinity School from 1989, all the way to his retirement from Harvard in 2008. And after that, he's been a Bartlett research professor in New England church history. And Professor Hall is a leading scholar in study of early New England history. And also he's a fan and a great scholar in the study of books. So he knows how to trace and where the rarely found books in the U.S., especially in the early colonial period. That's, I think, his hobbies, and also is a great contribution to the study of American culture. And chief among his publication is his award-winning main publication entitled "World of Wonders, Days of Judgment," published in 1989. And then his most recent contribution called "Reforming People," published in 2011, which was also recently translated in Chinese, published in mainland China, and earlier this year. And what else? Probably that's it. No, but I would like to take this great opportunity to share 2 personal stories with Professor Hall. And as you know, and this is not my own specialty. So the reason why I'm chair is only because I was a student of Professor Hall at Harvard University. In 2001, I went to study at Harvard, and at that time there were 2 required courses for all PhD students. And namely, it's one called the Religion 2001, offered in the first semester, and then Religion 2002 offered in the 4th semester. And Professor Orsi, Robert Orsi, whose name you will hear about later in today's lecture. Professor Orsi was a teacher for Religion 2001, and Professor Hall was the teacher for Religion 2002. And as you know, English is always a great barrier and obstacle for international students, and I was no exception. So in Professor Orsi's seminar, I couldn't even follow the conversation. So sometimes when I try to say something, the topic was already shifted to something else. So I tried, and then failed. So that was extremely frustrating. But then in the 4th semester, I had the great fortune to take Professor Hall's seminar, and it was mainly because of his very warm encouragement. So I finally feel encouraged gradually caught up and feel like I was able to equally participate in the conversation. So that was very important, not only to my psychological obstacle, to the healing of my psychology, and also I finally feel I had some confidence in my career at Harvard. So that was the first personal story with Professor Hall. And the second one is during the same time I also encountered some financial crisis because I was short of personal fundings, and my wife at that time was trying to apply for a PhD program, and we had no idea where she's going. So we were extremely anxious about how much money we have for the next year. And Professor Hall was at that time the chair of our committee on the study of religion. And through his very strong support, I managed to receive very generous funding, like a few thousand US dollars from Harvard University. And also, he was so kind as to hire me as a teaching fellow in the following fall semester, from which I also learned a lot. I still remember the title, it was a junior tutorial, and officially, junior tutorial would not hire any teaching fellow, for junior tutorial. But Professor Hall managed to hire me as an unofficial teaching fellow and give me some stipend to sustain myself. So I always feel very much appreciated for Professor Hall's very strong support and encouraging. And I didn't get a chance to say thank you to you when I graduated in 2009, because at that time he was already retired, and he was hiding himself in some mountains in Maine. He is very small height in Maine, so I couldn't locate him. So I wanted to take this opportunity to say thank you and for all your very strong support and teaching. So without your encouragement, I'm afraid I could not have my little achievement today. So thank you very much, and very glad to see you again after so many years. And I hope you enjoy your stay in Taiwan. And now the microphone is yours. Yeah, thank you very much.
He was an excellent teaching fellow, and I do want to say that I have done administrative work at two different universities, Boston University, where I was chair of the program for a number of years, and at Harvard. And of course there are rules. There are always rules. And the rules about when students should register and how many courses they can take and how the funding is arranged and all kinds of rules. And a wise administrator learns very quickly two things. Learn the rules, and then learn how to go around the rules. And because the rules are not perfect. It's like live religion, actually. It's a good example of live religion. There's orthodoxy, what the official rules are, and then there's what works to the benefit of people and programs. And that should always come first, provided that you're not just rebelling, just not some wild person, always understanding the rules, by the reasons for the rules. So, at Boston University, I earned a reputation for helping students work around the rules, or with the rules and around the rules. Rules are good, but in the case of very able students, especially international students, it's very, very important to see that they're not failing, they're not in difficulties. It's really the system that can be better. You can just intervene at the right moment and make things better. I want to say again, I'll say more tomorrow afternoon about the strong feelings I have of thanks already to several of you in this room. But let me turn now to the subject of this lecture on lived religion. And I'm going to refer, you'll see images in a short while of some of the books I'm citing. But the first slide here is one that's not part of your packet. So preparing for this lecture, I got in touch with the sociologist Nancy Emmerman, who is a contributor to my own book, edited book, Live Religion, and teaches now at Boston University, which is very close to Harvard geographically, to ask her for advice on current work in Live Religion that I might have overlooked. And she responded by providing me with an immense, very, very large, really gigantic bibliography, of which a copy is available, will be available, posted for you in some manner. It's a terrifying bibliography because it's very, very big. So I have to say, frankly, I have read 1%, maybe 1% of the titles listed on this bibliography. But I share it with you, thanks to Professor Emmerman. I share it to you because it shows how quickly this term was taken up and appropriated in American scholarship and trans-American scholarship. It's really quite amazing how quickly this term was taken up. Taken up by different disciplines, by the way, not just historians. I'm a historian. Professor Emmerman is a sociologist, and some of you here today are sociologists. And when I had a grant, I was given a grant money by an American foundation to organize a conference and then to pay for the costs of doing this book. My goal was to bring together sociologists and historians, and Professor Emmerman is a contributor to the book I'll show you in a moment, and the very important French sociologist Daniel Carvier-Leger, whose name is, you're not going to see on the screen, came also to that conference. And I want to report here something that I hope will come up for discussion. It came up indirectly when I was talking about church and state. And the question is, in what ways do historians of religion and sociologists of religion share the same projects, the same arguments, the same assumptions? And I would just report to you that in my personal experience at Harvard, during the years that I was chair of religion, there was never a sociologist on the standing committee of 20 faculty, never a sociologist. There were anthropologists, philosophers, and textual critics for various programs, never a sociologist. And at the Divinity School then and now, there is not a professor of the sociology of religion, not someone with a sociology background. And in my day-to-day life as a historian, I don't have lunch with sociologists, not because I dislike sociologists, but because the back and forth between sociology and history at Harvard seems to be very deficient. It doesn't, the sociologists don't seem interested in the historians, and vice versa. And I can look back to a period of time, 1950s, 1960s, when that was different. So there's a lesson here that, let me use the word partnerships. Partnerships are not fixed in stone, they're not permanent. They shift as needs change, people's needs, intellectual needs change. But I don't think it's good. I don't think it's good that lived religion should be owned by historians or owned by sociologists. It really is a term that both fields of study can use. And it can be used across all forms of religious history, as I hope to show. So that's just a quick introduction here, which I know there are sociologists here in the audience, and I want to make that point that if I don't cite more sociologists later on, it has a context, a Harvard-specific context. I do, however, want to say, as a way of introduction, that I owe the term lived religion to a French sociologist, whose name, again, is not before you here. He's no longer living. I never met him. His name is Gabriel Lebras, L-E-B-R-A-S, who in the 1930s pioneered the close investigation of Catholic practice in France, going parish by parish by parish, very much like a sociologist, looking for ways of counting who came to the Mass in a village or a town, who did not come to the Mass, how often people came to the Mass, how often they stayed away, who preferred to be married by a priest, who had a civil marriage, who brought their children to be confirmed. This is one of the sacraments of the Catholic Church at the age of 12 or 13 or 14, who did not bring their children to be confirmed. He wanted to create let's call it a map of religious practice for all of France. An amazing project that his students then actually completed after he died. And there is a map of religious practice published in the 1980s of religious practice in France. And so Lebras, because I could read French, I could read Lebras' work. And as I say, I learned from him this concept of la religion vécue, vécue means lived in French, and I simply translated it into English because we did not have the equivalent term in English. So I want to acknowledge Lebras' presence and my debt to a sociologist. And if there's time today, or perhaps on tomorrow, I'll say a little bit more about Lebras' work. I actually have a wonderful story of his own story, that I can repeat to you. So live religion came into being in English at a certain time, the 1990s, but even, and show the slide now. First, keep still this, get rid of this. Get rid of it. The first slide.
有兴趣的人
There we go. So the book grew out of a conference that was held at the Harvard Divinity School in 1994, and the preparation for it began in 1991 in terms of inviting people, looking around for people. As I said to you before, there are a collection of essays in the volume. It's not a book I wrote, it's a book I edited, and there is one essay in it that I wrote that I'll talk about tomorrow. And there are two sociologists, and then religionists and historians, and actually somebody in literature. Three of them were my doctoral students at Harvard, and the rest were not. Robert Orsi, just mentioned, who was not then at Harvard, has an essay in it as well. And so books don't come from nowhere. You know, it's not as though one day there isn't a book and the next day there is a book. So I want to talk about a genealogy here, an origins story. I want to tell you an origins story. And I'm going to include myself in this origins story. Next slide, please. But the first person I want to turn to is someone no one in this room has probably heard of, and don't feel embarrassed by that, because right now I'm back teaching, training 2 more doctoral students in theory and method in religion. And I said to them the other day, you have to read S.H. Connolly's Priest and People in Greek Famine. They said, what's that book? What is that book? I never heard of that book. So I was very, very lucky. I was at a conference one day and someone said, there's an interesting book you should read. By the way, this is another lesson that you learn from professional life. Pay attention. When someone says to you, I'm reading a fascinating book, don't go home and say, oh, that was a stupid idea. Go home and say, I should look at that book. It's very, very important. There is always, you're nodding your heads, always an informal bibliography of what is important, as opposed to the official bibliography of what is important. And the official bibliography is always behind or incomplete. So I was recommended to read this book. And then next slide, please. No one recommended William Freehoff's work to me, but this I came upon on my own. again because he had published in French as well as in Dutch, which I can't read. And very, very fortunately, I think there's another slide. Yeah, no, go back. That's fine. Go back to Connolly. Go back to Connolly. He has published a collection of his essays in English that we'll talk about, and then at Harvard, I emailed a student of Islam because I know nothing about Islam, and I said, what should I read in Islamic studies that would be pertinent to a lecture on lived religion? And I was sent to a book by Nadia Abu Zahar that I'll talk about later on. I thought we had an image on the title page, and I'll say more about it when we come to it. So I'm going to talk about those three writers, three different books as a kind of genealogy, and then finally talk about my own book, Worlds of Wonder, that was mentioned a few minutes ago at the beginning here. And there are commonalities among these histories. We did not know of each other. We still don't know each other in a personal sense. I did once meet Professor Connolly, but it's fascinating to see that at the same time in the Netherlands, in Ireland, in Islamic studies in Egypt and Tunisia, and in the United States, same time, exactly the same time, the same problems had come up, and the same direction was taken, the same path was taken that we call lived religion. So that's what's so interesting to me. So I'm going to start with Professor Connolly, turn to Professor Freehoff, then Professor Zavar, and then my own case here this afternoon. After I do this, those four genealogies, I'm going to turn to a different way of doing lived religion that I won't comment on more here now, but prompted again by this bibliography and by my conversations with Professor Emeritus. If I speak too fast, am I speaking too fast? No? Okay. If I speak too fast, just go like this. I'll understand. So S.H. Connolly, Irish historian of modern Ireland, about 1980, tells us in an autobiographical statement that he wanted to write on the history of modern Catholicism in Ireland. And he took for granted, he tells us in his autobiographical statement in 1980, he took for granted that Ireland was a monolithic, thoroughly Catholic society in which everyone practiced exactly the same form of Catholicism, a uniformly Catholic society, a common culture, as he puts it. He tells us also that at the time he began to write his dissertation, do research for his dissertation, not a single historian of Catholicism in Ireland had ever used the term popular religion or popular culture. The term was not present in Irish Catholic studies. So that he tells us that his teachers told him that priest and people shared exactly the same religion. There was just one version of Catholicism in modern Ireland. Now, as a doctoral student, S.H. Connolly read a book by the English historian Keith Thomas, that some of you may know of, called Religion and the Decline of Magic, published in 1971, in which Keith Thomas showed that in early 17th century England, this is a book primarily about witch hunting and witchcraft, but Thomas shows that in a Christianized England, many people were also interested in astrology, or what Thomas calls magic. Not today the word we would want to use, not probably the right word. And he argues that magic, I'll use his word, magic, or we could say popular religion, was very much what ordinary people preferred to the official rules of the church. In other words, here you have official religion, here you have popular religion, astrology, fortune-telling, folk healing, and the like. Now, S.H. Connolly, to go back to Ireland, S.H. Connolly thought, under the influence of Keith Thomas, let me look at local records. This is crucial to live religion, to look at local records. It's crucial to my work, crucial to S.H. Connolly, to look at local records that show what people are doing. And the first thing he learned when he looked at local records is that people in Ireland were not coming to the Mass. They were supposed to come to the Mass, but they weren't coming to the Mass. This is very much in the same line as Gabriel Lebras' work on France, where some people were coming to the Mass, but other people weren't coming to the Mass, even though officially they were coming to the Mass. And then secondly, S.H. Connolly learned that the event that really drew energies and excitement and attendance and, people wanted to be there was an event. It's very hard to, it's an impossible word to translate. It's what happens at a funeral service, at a death service. And so there's the priest sprinkling water on the coffin. People are sort of bored by that. And then there's a party that happens. It's called the wake, W-A-K-E. And the wake in 18th century, early 17th century, early 19th century Ireland was an excuse for getting very, very drunk. Extremely drunk. Immense quantities of alcohol were consumed at the wake. And when people got drunk, there was also sexual misbehavior. People went off to the dark corners of the church or the dark corners of the tavern, and people would have quarrels. And from an official point of view, very, very disorderly, very, 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 very ugly event. But it was the heart of everyday religion. The wake was what people gathered for, enthusiastic about in everyday religion. Then his book becomes a story of change. Ireland has a very peculiar history because it was governed by England. But the first Irish seminary for training priests was founded in 1790. And the teachers who came to this seminary were from France. Some of them chased out of France at the time of the French Revolution. And they began to train a new generation of priests. Connolly's story of the wake is the priest also went to the wake and got drunk. So the priests were, on the one hand, a little unhappy, but on the other hand, they were also local people. Now you have this seminary in Dublin, the capital, sending out, we might call them modernizers or rigorous priests, very rigorous priests. And they arrive in their villages and they encounter the wake. They encounter people who are not coming to Mass on a regular basis. And they begin to use their authority to stamp out, to eliminate, or to regulate, or to punish a popular religion. Let me put it this way. These priests enact a disciplinary revolution. A disciplinary revolution. And so the Catholicism that S.H. Connolly thought had always been Irish Catholicism, was actually very recent. It dated from the middle of the 19th century. So this is a story of two different versions of lived religion. And I'll come back later on in other stories I tell, especially on Thursday, to stories of modernizers or disciplinary figures who intervened to transform the structure of religion. It's a recurring process in modern religious history, and it goes back earlier. I want to just quote to you from Connolly's book here. This is from his introduction to the second edition of his book. I began to glimpse the outlines of a world quite different from anything I had been taught to expect. The difference between the world of Orthodox Catholic doctrine on the one hand and the customs and beliefs of the Catholic countryside people on the other hand. And again, in terms of words, key words, what Connolly does is to take the word superstition, which was a word in the official vocabulary, bad, superstition is bad, and to transform superstition into a version of lived religion. It's not bad. You take away the sign of bad. It's simply what people do. So Connolly really single-handedly, by this one book, transformed the study of Catholicism in modern Ireland, which was always focused on priests and structures and seminaries and things of that sort, into a much broader field, which included the people. Now I turn to, if you'll turn to Freehoff, if you will. Yeah. I think we have his book title. Oops, keep going. Oh, go back to Freehoff. Okay, sorry. I should be looking at myself at the beginning. So William Freehoff, again, I mentioned his name to my two students the other day. They showed no interest at all. No interest at all in learning anything about Professor Freehoff. So if you haven't heard of him, don't feel embarrassed. 99% of Americanists in America, people who teach American literature, will never have heard of this man. But he's a very great scholar in the Netherlands and in Europe. So he too wrote an autobiography from which I'm going to quote, and it's in a collection of his essays. He said that when he was trained in the 1960s, he was trained to think that the task of the historian was to describe the history of the church as an institution, institutional history. And then he tells us in his autobiography that thanks to his teachers in France and also to wider reading he did, that he decided that what he wanted to study was not only the church, but what was outside the church, but also religious. So his is a model that in a sense is a spatial model, the church and then outside the church, or outside the official rules of the church. So in one of his essays that's been translated into English, he did something that no other Dutch scholar had ever done. And that, by the way, is also rare in American scholarship. It's a case study, it's an example study of a layperson, a layman, who was struggling with official doctrine and who wrote out a series of, in his journal, in a diary, wrote out his confusion about a doctrine. It's the Protestant doctrine of predestination, that some of you may have heard of, famous because of its place in Calvinism, the doctrine of predestination. And so he's very worried. Is he saved or is he not saved? How does he know if he's saved? How does he know if he's not saved? So in this essay, Freehoff translates doctrine into personal experience. And it's not a matter of belief. I believe the doctrine, or I don't believe the doctrine. It's how I live with the doctrine. The doctrine is a matter of experience. And the experience is confusing. It's very important to recognize that for this man, the layman, Freehoff as representing the layman, the experience is confusing. So doctrine, lay people, confusion, experience. It's a fascinating essay. And to my great pleasure, in reading this essay, I realized that this very confused Dutch man was confused in part because he had come across a story about an Italian that I repeat in Worlds of Wonder, the book I'll come to in just a minute. It's a story about a 16th century Italian man at a time of the Reformation who converts to Protestantism. And then he goes back to being a Catholic. So it's a Protestant story, because the story is that when he goes back to being a Catholic, the swarm of flies descend on him. Flies cover him. And he takes this to be a sign that God is punishing him for giving up Protestantism and going back to Catholicism. And he dies a fearful death. He dies a fly, he's covered with flies. This is symbolic, of course, you understand. This is not real flies. This is imaginary flies, but real in his imagination. And he dies a horrible death. Now, I have no idea whether this story is true or false. It doesn't matter whether it was true or false. It was very real to this Dutchman that he might suffer the same horrible fate if he's not, can't understand the doctrine of election. And if any of you happen to read my essay on Samuel Sewall, that was mentioned to you as possible reading for this lecture, Samuel Sewall, who was a magistrate, not a minister, magistrate living in late 17th century Boston, who kept a diary, his 12-year-old daughter came into his bedroom one morning and said, "I think I'm another Francis Spira." So this story is present not only in the Netherlands, in France, in Italy, in England. It made its way all the way to New England. Retold, 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 retold. And it's a gorgeous example of lived religion, because it's not official doctrine. It's made into a play in England. It's dramatized in various ways. So Freehoff's essay is about, as I say, you start with a doctrine, but you translate the doctrine into lived experience. And Connolly is about the church and its rules and about the Mass and the wake. Freehoff is about a broader understanding of doctrine. Now I turn now to a more recent scholar of Islam, whom I don't know, Nadia Zahra, Z-H-R-A, in a book called The Pure and the Powerful, 1997. And she again is autobiographical in her opening introduction about what she was taught, how she was taught to understand Islam in Egypt, which is one of the subjects of her work, her field work. She, by the way, is an anthropologist in terms of her discipline. And she was taught that official Islam, the Islam of the teachers in the mosque, was never understood by ordinary people. So she was taught that, she was told by her teachers and the scholarship on which she was relying, that Orthodox Islam was very different from what the country people were practicing, and actually taught that the country people could not understand. So one of the key terms in her book, also a key term in my book, is the word literacy. Well, what would that? What's the Chinese word for literacy? Literacy means can you read? Can you write? And in the early modern period, it's a very important question. It's still an important question. Who can read? Who can write? Because literacy then becomes a doorway into do you understand orthodoxy or not understand orthodoxy and the like. And her argument, using quite specific field work, involves listening to women in her field work as an anthropologist in Egypt, listening to women who were illiterate, had never been to school, nonetheless reciting the Quran. Illiterate woman reciting the Quran, and asking her, she was literate, if their understanding of the Quran was correct. In other words, they were not over here, and the official church was there, at all. It's a very, very interesting series of essays in the book, The Pure and the Powerful, about the capacity of ordinary people in Egypt today to actually practice and understand Orthodox Islam. There's a second aspect of her work, and that is about symbols, the symbols in the language these people employ, the symbolic language these people employ. And I mention this to you because, just for future reference, I found this extremely interesting. So she was in Tunisia. She's done field work in Egypt and Tunisia. And there was a drought taking place. And she studies the language that people have for talking about drought and the rituals they practice to restore water, to end the drought, and how their ritual language is charged with symbols taken from the Quran. So the local rituals for reintroducing water, for ending the drought, are not secular, or not in ordinary people's language. They are also showing the presence of Islam. So hers is a book which she never uses the word live religion, but she very much writes in that vein. Now I want to talk about, turn to my, here we now have a real book title, my own book, easy to show. So let me tell you about autobiographically about my own situation. So I began as an intellectual historian. That's a name we use in the United States for people who study ideas. And who has ideas? Well, the elite have ideas, and ordinary people don't have ideas. So my teachers taught me to read sermons. They taught me to read philosophical texts. They taught me to read very serious people, William James, and Jonathan Edwards, and John Calvin, if I were going to go back to the 16th century. They never taught me, they never said to me, never said, go look at local records and ask yourself what ordinary people were thinking. Never did that come up as a question or a proposal for me. And one of the reasons it did not come up is, again, the question of literacy. Because it was assumed that the church, the official church, used a very esoteric language of doctrine that was hard for ordinary people to understand. And then there was the question of the Bible, and the fact that the official church was interpreting the Bible in a certain way. And the Bible was and is a very symbolic book, and hard to understand, still is hard to understand. And so how could ordinary people really learn about the Bible? So I went to the local records, and I went to court records, people turning up in courts, civil courts, to dispute, land or inheritance or all kinds of things. And the first question I asked myself was, are they illiterate? Are they illiterate or literate? And I looked at hundreds of court cases, and I found one person who was illiterate, who could not understand. It had to be explained to him what was in the document. What I found instead was thousands of documents being produced by local people to write out their petitions, their pleas for help, their depositions in a case. I found an enormous mass of writing. And then I turned, it was mentioned that I was interested in the history of books. So I asked myself, what were they reading? What were these people reading? And I found that they could read, and that there were very inexpensive books being published for ordinary people. And I could go to probate inventories, and I could go to inventories made after death. This was a method pioneered by the French, and find what they were reading. Thirdly, I began to look for stories that these people were sharing, and I came across dreams. Now, in other religious cultures, dreams play a large role. In the history of American Puritanism, dreams had never been mentioned or taken seriously. Dream lore, dreams, visions, apparitions, supernatural events, wonder stories. In the Samuel Sewall essay, I tell a series of these because Samuel Sewall collected stories of events. So one of them is quite funny. That is, Samuel Sewall was very afraid of France. And one day he's looking down at his baby in the crib, 20-month-old baby in the crib, and the baby says, "The French are coming. The French are coming." And Sewell's, what? And he thinks this is a prophetic voice from heaven telling him that the French are coming. It's astonishing. So none of my teachers had ever paid any attention at all to this kind of practice of listening to children, of collecting stories of dreams and visions. And so I began to collect these. And the very title of my book, the word wonder, is a 17th century word. I mean, it's a many kind of word, but a 17th century word for these kinds of extraordinary, ordinary events. So in my own transition from being a historian of ideas to a historian of lived religion, this is a book in lived religion, although the book doesn't use that term, it meant looking outside the official rules to this tremendous amount of material that showed what people were thinking and feeling and so forth. And I put on the, just for fun, I show you here a passage from Geoffrey Chaucer, the great English author, Canterbury Tales, story of how children learned to read. Do we have time? I don't think we have time to do this. But it turned out that you learn to read by memorizing, and hearing orally, chanted, and then you learn to read. And children learn to read in less than 2 years. Now today, people takes years and years. In the early modern period, it was very easy to learn to read. Paradox, kind of a paradox. Easier to learn to read then than it is now, because you did it by going from the oral to the written rather than from the written to the oral. And then I found that people could recite great passages of the Bible because they heard them orally and they learned them. And then, above all, there was music. The Puritan culture was a culture centered on psalm singing, the singing of psalms from the Old Testament. And everyone could sing these psalms. 6-year-olds, old people, young people, everyone could sing these psalms. So that if we were to ask a very straightforward question, how did people learn to be religious? Very straightforward question. How did they learn to be religious? They learned it from psalm singing. They learned it from hearing the Bible read to them and then sharing Bible stories among themselves. They learned it from sermons, which were in oral form. And they learned it from sharing stories, passing on stories, sharing stories with each other about wonders. So let me now look back at all four of these case studies: mine, Professor Zahar's, Connolly's, and Freehall's. So the great strength of this work, and the reason it can be called lived religion, is that it does not, it rejects any strict boundary. It rejects any strict boundary between the institution of the church or temple, and what people actually are practicing as religion. It opens up the places, the space where religion is being learned and practiced. That's one of its great advantages. It is not limited to the elite, and it is not limited to simply the church as an institution. The second great merit of this approach is that it takes seriously everyday experience. My colleague Robert Orsi, my friend and colleague Robert Orsi, puts experience first as a key word in the vocabulary of lived religion. Actually, there are problems with the word experience. Maybe this afternoon we can touch on those. It's not, for me, it's not a strong word. It's a complicated word. But it, nonetheless, lived religion does open up the term to experience. Or I would put it a different way. It opens us up to storytelling. And storytelling is usually about experience. So these are strengths of the lived religion approach that all of us share. Next slide, please. And having mentioned Robert Orsi's name to you, let me just turn to his book called The Madonna of 115th Street, Faith and Community in Italian Harlem. By the way, this book comes with a series of autobiographical introductions, so you can follow Professor Orsi along the way of his journey. Now, this is a book that affirms, and complicates the category of lived religion. It both sustains, affirms, and complicates the category of lived religion, as I have been talking about it here. So let me just say a brief word about Orsi's meaning, and then I'll turn very briefly to a shift of paradigms. So Orsi himself is an Italian-American, and this is a book about a church founded by immigrants to America, Catholic immigrants from southern Italy, the late 19th century, the very late 19th century. A church, an immigrant church, so a kind of outsider church, because coming into a more Protestant culture. And Orsi is interested in this book not in the Mass, not in confirmation, not in baptism, not in any of the 7 sacraments that the church is actually practicing. He is only interested in once a year, this church celebrates the statue of the Virgin that they happen to have, a particular version of the Virgin Mary. And it's a festival that takes place in the street outside the church. And in this book, Orsi evokes the smell of the sausages being cooked. Here in Taipei, you have sausages being cooked on the street. You can appreciate that in the Bronx, East Bronx of New York, sausages were being cooked everywhere. Italians were famous in America for sausage. German students, Italian, very, very famous for sausage. He evokes the smell of the sausage, the music being played, which is not religious music, but popular music. It's a festival taking place in the street, and he has the word street in the title. That's not insignificant. It's not the Madonna of the church on 115th Street. It's the Madonna of the street. So the Madonna statue is literally taken out of the church and brought into the street. So I can ask you the question, what's so striking about this? And what's so striking is the priests never are mentioned in this book. The local bishop is never mentioned in this book. And Professor Orsi has a love-hate relationship. I happen to know him very well personally. He has a love-hate relationship with Catholicism. Many people do, many Catholics do. So he did not want to have priests in his story, or bishops, just the people. The people are in this story, and especially women are part of the story. It's women who are the major, most important people in the procession, the great procession that concludes the festival. But I want to say one more thing about this book that's a true example of lived religion. There is a chapter in this book, one chapter in this book, is entitled The Meanings, plural, the meanings of the Madonna. And I recommend this chapter to you methodologically, because lived religion is about the richness of meaning, the many layers of meanings that develop around a religious symbol. Orsi's chapter, The Meanings of the Madonna, is just really a superb example of taking something, not the meaning, but the meanings of this symbol. It's a very, very useful book in that regard. I should say, finally, I'm running out of time here, so I need to push on to the next slide, please. Oh, I just wanted to show this slide. Here you get a little taste of French. As you see, Histoire vécue, lived history of the people of Christian. And this is a collection from the 1980s in the Gabriel Lebras mode by students at Lebras. A 2-volume work, a collection of essays that, again, nobody in America has ever read at all. But I mentioned, to be honest, I want to be honest to you here about my own indebtedness to the French tradition. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Okay, now, so I've been describing the 1980s and the 1990s to you, as in the Netherlands and in England, in Ireland, in America, the emergence of lived religion. And I want to just tell you that there's another version of lived religion that's emerged in America in recent years. And it's quite different from my version of lived religion. I want to be honest with you that there's an alternative to what I've been arguing. And this alternative is tied to quite specific historical circumstances. The decline in attendance at churches, Christian churches in America, so that many people have stopped attending church altogether. It's tied to the fact that many people who might regard themselves or grew up as Christians are now also Buddhists. So people are mixing and matching religions. It's tied to the, we might here use the word that you wanted me to use the other day, secularization. It's tied in some sense to the process of secularization, so that people no longer strongly affiliate with churches. And there's a British sociologist, some of you may know, some of you do know, I'm sure, named Grace Davies, with an S on the end, who has introduced the term, it's very hard to translate, I think, vicarious religion. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Okay, yeah. So this is a collection of essays by her students, by Grace Davies' students, and here's the word I'm quoting here, this last word, vicarious religion, that she has used in books and essays. And vicarious religion means, it's a paradox, it's a paradoxical term, because it's not about religion as most of you in this room understand it. It's about like substitutes for religion, or sort of like religion. And Professor Hervé Leger is responsible for the term religion as memory. In other words, people aren't religious, but they remember what it was like to be religious. So go back to the previous slide. So I want to mention a book which is a perfect example, a pure example of this new approach. Actually, an earlier book. Meredith McGuire's Ritual Healing in Suburban America. She is an anthropologist. So this is a case study. You won't believe this. Maybe you will believe this. It's a case study of a woman who each day practices 5 different ways of healing. 5 different ways of healing. One way is Christianity. She says prayers. Another way is yoga, which is not an American, did not begin in America. A third way is through nutrition, regulating what she eats. A fourth way is all kinds of weird new religious practices. And a fifth way is traditional Asian religion. She's close to Buddhism. 5 different ways. You say, how can this be? How can this be? But that's what she is. And it doesn't matter whether it's 5 or 3 or 10 or 15. This is a model, an example of how many Americans now are religious. They pick and choose, they mix and match. They go to church, they don't go to church. They pick and choose, mix and match. This is a completely different model of lived religion. And it has something to do with the immigration to America of more people from Asia, more people from outside Europe. And it's, as I say, it requires a different framework. Also, the very process of de-Christianization or secularization requires a different framework. How do you talk about people who aren't religious, but are religious? Orsi's book is about religion in the streets, but it's very definitely about religion. It's not about not religious, it's about being religious. My work is about people being religious. Now you have to have books that are about people who are somewhat religious, but not religious, or mixing and matching. And the other day, the perfect example came to my mailbox. An autobiography. I love autobiographies because to historians, they're so rich. So those of you who know Harvard Divinity School know that it publishes a magazine 3 or 4 times a year called the Harvard Divinity School Bulletin. It's actually a magazine. And the most recent issue has an interview. And I'm going to conclude today by quoting from the interview. It's not on the screen. Just have to listen to it. It's an interview of a man who is an African American who, as a child, was a Baptist. Most African Americans are Baptists. Many are Baptists. And he did very, very well. He became a Rhodes Scholar, going to Oxford for study. He earned a PhD in New Testament at Emory University, and he taught New Testament at various places. And then he became the minister of a famous church in New York City called Riverside Church, which has no denominational affiliation. And now he's out there wandering around. So I want to quote to you, and this will be a little hard to some of these words. So he talks about going to Africa as a graduate student. I began to imagine religion as a complex performance of intertwining voices. And Christianity was an important voice, but not the only voice. The solo had become a chorus. Then he talks about the imperative of practicing interfaith cooperation. He talks about learning from every faith. His own faith now is a composite of pieces he has taken, like the woman who has 5 healing practices every day. So he is what I would call a seeker. He seeks to learn from everywhere. There's no one place he can land at all. He wants to learn from the ancestral spirits of Africa as an African American. He wants to learn from Buddhism. He wants to learn from Hinduism. He wants to learn from Christianity. He wants to learn from whatever he can find out there. So he legitimizes all these possibilities. And the key word here is not experience, but spirituality. Terrible word, spirituality. Just an awful word. Please don't use it. Because it means nothing and everything at the same time. You can call this event spirituality. Anything can be called spirituality. I'm kidding you, of course. If someone this afternoon uses the word spirituality, I am not going to complain. But I was pleased, Justin, to have you nod your head when I said that experience is on sandy foundations, right? No sure foundations for the word experience, and spirituality is even softer foundation. And for people like the man I just quoted, his name is Brad Braxton, you can feel in my own voice a certain uneasiness with how floating he is, how unmired, unanchored he is. He just floats around the world, picking up wherever he wants. So to conclude, there's a model of lived religion which I myself practice, or try to practice, which actually takes the institution seriously and takes its rules seriously, but then looks to see how those rules are put into practice by ordinary people. The model that I'm citing here at the end does not really take institutions seriously, because its assumption is institutions are extremely weak. They're no longer able to be effective teachers or rule makers. And there's a truth to that. So in effect, we are now in 2016, we have before us at least two quite different ways of understanding contemporary religion in America and elsewhere. My way, or my way, that's also the way of Connolly and others. And Bob Horsey is sort of between the two models. And then this other model of vicarious religion, or religion as memory, or religion as simply spirituality, kind of universal spirituality, two different models. Thank you very much for listening so carefully.
Okay, so what a rich and wonderful lecture. I'm sure you have, every one of you have been enlightened, if not by spirituality, then must by religious experience. Okay, so now the forum is open. So any comments, thoughts, any questions, are welcome.
Well, I simply like to save time, to spend on waiting. So let me simply raise the first question. What you just taught reminds me of many similar trends of academic activities. I didn't mention non-school. It seems that perhaps I'm not qualified to talk about this in detail, but I think in your expertise, I think you should know, this kind of a trend very well, developed by the French scholars, who are interested in local details, what people were doing in their own towns and their sort of everyday life. So that's one thing. And in the field of religious studies, I think some giant figures like Monsieur Eliade already mentioned, reminded us of the fact that actually Europe is not monolithic. We tend to see Europe as a Christian, as a unified Christianity. But actually, he said, no, if you go to the countryside, you can discover a lot of practices which were considered to be heretic. And so that's the reason why he would develop sort history of religions, using many local informational data for his construction of his very big theory. And that's another thing. So my feeling is that in your presentation you presuppose a kind of orthodox consensus. I use the term developed by Anthony Giddens, the British social scientist. And so it seems that you would like to get away from that orthodox consensus and try to, to reconstruct another kind of paradigm. I totally agree with you that it's very, very important. Perhaps our way of seeing things, we put our understanding in a more very categorical, styles, and which were defined by the tradition. And each discipline has its own very rigid understanding and methodology, and that certainly is not creative, to or say, beneficial, to our understanding on our, the newly developed phenomena in our world. So I simply have to throw this out as a response.
Yeah. Let me be brief because each one of those is a rich point. Let me start with your final point. There's a paradox, and I've been in academic life for a long time, and so I've seen this paradox over and over and over again. We need categories. I'll give you an example. American. When I started out in my graduate work in 1959, American was the dominant category. And we all took for granted we knew what American meant. We just took it for granted we knew what American meant. And so the task was to find more examples of the American, locally. We didn't have any other category. We just had the category American. And nowadays, that would be considered very, very bad, just to take, American as a uncritical category. I mean, there still are people who do that, but scholars don't do that anymore. So the paradox is we and I'll go back to your point about Eliana, we criticize a category and then it reappears. We make discoveries and they disappear. So the insight that Christianity is not monolithic is a very old insight, and yet it keeps disappearing, and then it has to reappear. So I would really want to be an example of humility here, in the sense that I happen to be just part of a group of people who rediscovered the importance of the particular and the local. And my work is no more important than the work of Freehoff in the Netherlands or in Europe, or Connolly in Ireland, or Keith Thomas in England, or many others like Robert Orsi. But it's just interesting how you have to keep those processes of rediscoveries. Christianity itself, we now know that early Christianity was a cluster of different little flavors of Christianity, And then Paul comes along and tries to unify those, right? And then by the 4th century, it's more unified. And then back and forth it goes. So, I adopt absolutely your point. On the Annales School, and I'm at the risk of talking about something some of you don't know about, but in the I can't, sorry, I just have to go ahead here. So the problem with the Annales School of Work was that it depended upon a strict separation of high and low. It was based upon a strict separation of high and low. So the younger generation of Annales scholars, starting in 1970s, 80s, to whom I'm also indebted, began to criticize that strict separation of high and low. But the classic Annales work of 1930s, 40s, 50s, early 60s was a high-low model with a literacy-illiteracy gap. So, but I owe a great deal to figures such as Roger Chartier and others who were criticizing that model later on. But the pure Annales of Marc Bloch and Lucien Febvre and so forth and so on, it's very, very interesting work, but
to ask a question. You mentioned the divide between the scholars in history, in the field of history and sociology, on the topic of lived religion. And I would like to ask, what's the reason? Because I recall a critique by Robert Ursi, who says that the American academia is sort of embedded in the mainstream Protestantism, and is like secured in the academia, and they want to face the messiness of the lived religion. I would like to ask you about your opinion about this issue.
Yeah, two things. Well, three things. First of all, sociology is a big discipline with many, it's a big house with many rooms. And so that many of the rooms are what we would call, historians would call quantitative rooms, and involves testing of hypotheses with quantitative variables. And historians don't do that. So from a sociology point of view, they're very lazy. They have no method for sorting out this factor versus that factor. Then there's the room in which sociologists are doing interviews. And Nancy Emmerman's work is based in part on interviews. Robert Wethnow's work, the great Princeton sociologist, uses interviews. And now suddenly you have a partnership between the two. So the social sciences in America, and probably here in Japan, are called upon to predict using quantitative data. Historians can't predict because we don't have that kind of data. We don't think that way. And it goes back to the word experience. That is a key word for historians of lived religion, and it's not a key word. You can't quantify experience. You really can't do it. It's too soft. It's too soft a word. You can't use it. So I can work easily with Nancy Emmerman. Even though when I asked Nancy Emmerman to refer me to the most recent important work, she sent me 2 articles that I could not understand because they were applying variable analysis. I couldn't understand them. I mean, I literally could not understand them. But face to face, we can talk easily. So there are these deep differences that, again, going back to your point about, I can think back to my student days when I was reading David Reisman, who was technically a sociologist. I was reading Ronald Bella, a sociologist, but very close to being an anthropologist. Oh, he's an anthropologist, especially. Bella was an anthropologist, or was he a sociologist? Sociologist, but he was very close to being an anthropologist. And he was in religion. So there are these moments that happen. And then we also shifted to Clifford Geertz, who most definitely was not a sociologist, an anthropologist, a cultural anthropologist. But I'd be more interested in hearing about bridge building than underscoring or re-emphasizing difference. I would be, as I said, the conference that I held in 1994 that led to this book, Nancy was there, Danielle Hervieux was there, a couple of other sociologists were invited. But they were sympathetic people. I mean, they were, could talk broadly across boundaries. So I don't have a firm answer to your question. I'll stop here because have I partly answered your question?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, as I say, the category of experience or spirituality, sociologists are not comfortable with categories like that. Let me offer you another example, secularization, which came up on Monday. So the people in religious studies detest the word secularization. They want to talk about revitalization, re-Christianization. They want to talk about the possibility that religion is not dying, but being reborn in different forms, here, there, everywhere. Look outside, there it is. Your sociologists don't see it. You don't see it. Right? You can't see it. You don't know how to measure it. There it is. It's being reborn. So that in that very topic of secularization, there's a fascinating tension between a pure sociological approach which sees the evacuation of religion from many parts of life. I actually talked about this on Monday, not using the word secularization so much. And then the religionist who says, well, no, look around the corner. There it is. Religion is coming back, or still there. So that's an interesting tension, disciplinary tension right now in America. You say religion is disappearing. I say religion is more vital than ever. How do you bridge that? How do you bring that together? Yeah, it's a very interesting challenge. Yes. Sorry. Well, yeah. We have until how long do we have? To noon.
Supposed to end
12. Full end at 12.
You mentioned about case study as a alternative model of lived religion of a woman who practiced. Okay. A woman who practices 5 ritual hearings a day, and that reminds me of my mother. That's exactly what she did every day. And she said prayers to God, and she prepared sacrifice to our ancestors every day in the morning. But if you asked her whether she is religious or not, or whether she believes in God or not, she would say no. She identifies herself, although not as a atheist, but she'll say she's not religious, and she considered what she does every day is just a part of Chinese culture, although that is already mixed and intertwined with a lot of elements. And so I think this goes back to the questions you proposed during the presentation, that how do people become religious? And you said that people become religious by citing the Bibles or separate texts and singing hymns. But I am wondering if that is enough for people to become religious. I mean, if they are not conscious of their being religious, are they still religious? And what do you think about it?
Yeah, this wonderful. Thank you. You brought the whole room. Everybody sat up and said, "Mothers." Thank goodness for our mothers. So the quickest way of answering your question is to say religious studies as a discipline is a ship that's sailing along, a boat sailing along, and it comes to your mother and it hits a rock and starts to sink because the category religion, what happens to the category of religion? Do we use the category religion to describe your mother, or do we need another set of words to describe your mother? And so, in America, just to go back to something I was saying earlier, the commonest thing to say is, I'm not religious, but I am spiritual. What does that mean? I am not religious, but I am spiritual. I don't believe. Roughly 25% of all the people under the age of 35 in America would say they don't believe. But are they not spiritual in some way? So we have a deep category issue here within religious studies. Because it goes back to sociology. We don't want to ignore those people. They're still part of we would like to include them in our scholarship. But under what category do we include them? It's a very, very interesting question. And I don't have a razor or a knife that I can say, cut this, cut it here, cut it there. It's a very interesting question for religious studies in America and probably here in Taiwan right now. And I want to say your mother is a legitimate figure of study. It's not that she's not a legitimate figure of study. She is a legitimate figure of study. She's worth studying for that very mixture of things. Professor McGuire is an anthropologist, by the way, not a historian, the one who wrote the book on this woman. But historians struggle with people like that because we don't have a good category for them. So you tossed in another question. How does she learn about all of these things? How does she know to do all these 5 things every day? And so I just want to, I know there's other questions. I just want to say that most recently there's been a book published by a young American scholar on Oprah Winfrey. Have any of you, do you know Oprah Winfrey, an African-American woman, immensely popular in the media? Oprah. And The Religion of Oprah. And this has been a controversial book in religious studies because Oprah is like your mother, very, very optimistic. If you do the right things, you'll be successful, you'll find a husband, or you'll have children, or you'll look attractive, or it's a confidence building. She's a confidence builder. And I might say, watching Oprah, this is shameful to be so, to suggest that you could do these 2 or 3 things and be confident, have confidence. But many, many, many women watch, my wife watches her show and subscribes to her magazine. And I said, why? But so again, you have a category question. And so just to conclude, the lesson of religion is, you don't be too categorical because you want to take seriously people like your mother. But where they learn this from, television or an interesting question. Where people learn these, if not in the traditional ways, that's for sure, not in the traditional ways. I mean, I went to a church as a child, I learned a catechism, I learned the songs, I learned the Bible, I had to memorize parts of the Bible. That's how I became religious. It's like a box. I was inside the box, very much inside the box. My family was inside the box. But your mother is not inside any box. No.
Thank you for your talks, wonderful talk with a lot of theoretical inspiring. I think native religion is a very good tool, but in analysis, in practice, I face 2 problems for putting into user tool to analysis. First problem is each religion different in great demand on individual in loyalty, in terms of commitment, loyalty, in terms of spend time and energy to the religion. For example, in Christian is a institutional context, but in Taiwanese folk religion, they never asking for a total commitment and don't ask the loyalty for people to go through the folk religion practice. For example, Mama Gaius example that combines all practice for healing, but it's never a problem for the folk religious believer like in Taiwan's Chinese religion. It's the first problem. Second problem, if we put this religion in research tool, we need to put religion in the local context. But the layer, so much layer of local context in the traditional society, maybe a territorial society, territorial village is the context in people embedded with the patriarchal system or embedded with the family system. But in the modern urban context, it's different total context. The local may be very isolated in the urban settings. So how to consider those different layers, different situations for context embedded in different
two terrific points, excellent point. And if your first point, I want to go back to Robert Orsi. I did not respond to Robert Dorsey's comment about Protestantism. So Robert Dorsey in much of his work, especially in a collection of essays that he published some years ago, is very anti-Protestant because he thinks that unintentionally religious studies in America absorbed a Protestant perspective. And you just put your finger precisely on one aspect of that it involves an internal commitment. And the internal commitment, it has to be in your heart. And in the people I study in the 17th century, that's the key. And I go to a church service every Sunday, and every Sunday I am told, you can't just be doing things, you have to believe and feel things inside yourself. The word is sincere. You have to be sincere, and that's an entirely internal word. And so to simplify, we are unconscious agents of our own religious culture in terms of understanding religion around the world. And there's a wonderful essay by Robert Sharp, I think, in American Critical Terms for Religious Studies, on the category of experience and whether it works across comparative religions or not. And but in Anglo-American Protestantism, it's a big word, it's a good word. But then you move to another tradition, maybe not. So you're quite right that self-criticism has to be part of our paradigm. The paradigm of doing this religion has to be involved in critique. I'll give you another example: mysticism. The attempt to impose the category of mysticism on Buddhism was a Western project, I believe. That's also part of that book. There's a piece on that. So when the field of comparative world religions arose in Germany and France and England and America in the 19th century, it had to have a few categories, and they tried to universalize these categories. Scriptures is an example, another example. You know, every religion had to have a scripture. If it didn't have a scripture, it wasn't a real religion. That's a very Protestant or Christian perspective on religion. So, yes, and then your point about family structure and context is a terrific point. And this is where sociologists are better than historians. Sociologists are better able to identify changes in family structure than historians are. It's one of the things they study is changes in family structure. We tend to study meanings, what family means. And Robert Dorsey's book, The Madonna on 115th Street, has another chapter on the Italian immigrant family structure. But if you were to go back today and redo that book, the structure of the family has changed completely. Completely. Just like you said, it has changed. Not meaning Italian Americans, but here in Taiwan. The tight family with the multi-generational household, where no young Italian girl could date without her father's permission, and above all, only date an Italian American. It's gone, completely gone, just gone. Doesn't exist except in myth, movies. Now intermarriage, in the church, outside the church, not getting married, having children, not being married. Anything is possible, as it is for all Americans. So his brilliant sociological chapter on the family is historical. It only refers to the 1920s and maybe the 1930s. Even the 1930s, you'd have to say, it's a little questionable. Or 1890, maybe that's what it refers to. It's very history bound. So we have to be very alert to that as well, that we're not employing a model of family or local. In America, America used to have regional food. There used to be regional foods in America. So if I went to the University of North Carolina to speak, I eat Southern food. Now I go to the University of North Carolina. It's the same food as I have in Massachusetts. All across the country, it's the same food, everywhere. Everywhere it's the same food. Now there's a little movement to pretend that there are differences of regional foods. So that too is a change. You know, it's just, so we're caught in very rapid change. We're caught in a very process of very rapid change, our own version of modernity, very rapid change. And your point is a good reminder that liberal religion is always struggling to keep up with those forms of change, to be accurate about those forms of change. Does that partly answer your question? Robert Wethno, in a great book,
It happened.
thank you, talks about the impact of the birth control pill on religion. The birth control pill. Because it allowed young women to postpone having children. And they did it by the millions. And what happened was it broke the connection between family formation and joining a church. It broke the connection between family formation and joining a church. In other words, the old pattern was you got married, bang, you had a child, and you joined a church. Now, no children, no marriage, don't join a church. And when the children come along and later on, so that's a little tiny example of shifts in family structure tied to shifts in religious practice. And who would have thought the birth control pill would have such an impact on religious practice? Yes. Yes.
Professor thank you. I want to ask a question. Next year is Martin Luther and the Reformed Church the 5,000 years, and I want to understand a question. The liberal religion finally it become the vicarious religion. Is that liberal religion finally become vicarious religion?
Vicarious.
My point, thank you for the question. My point would be you have a choice. You have a choice. You can choose one or the other, or yet still other possibilities, depending on what you are studying. I would suggest to all of you, don't let a category drive your work. Let your work drive the category. Should I say it again?
Yeah.
So if you start with a category, very often you'll confirm the category in your work. You'll find the category in your work. It's better to, you might have the category in mind, but it's much better to let the category grow out of your work. The question you are asking, the question you want to ask, leads you, you want to follow that question wherever it takes you. So, let me just be specific about my own. I've had a lot of doctoral students. I've taught a lot of doctoral students at Harvard. And I never said to any one of them, write a thesis on liberal religion. I never said that. I said, write a thesis on whatever you want to write a thesis on. You want to write it on Native American music? Write it on Native American music. You want to write a thesis on a charismatic women's group? Write it on a charismatic women's group. And if the word liberal religion helps you do that, that's fine. If it doesn't help you do that, that's fine too. So I don't mean to confuse you by being so emphatic here. So in your own work, if you were to, we don't have time, sadly, for you to describe your work, but you can choose. You can take what works for you. Your work will lead to, it starts with a question and it will lead to more questions. It will lead you in search of a paradigm that you can fit your work into. And don't let your teachers tell you it must conform to paradigm A or paradigm B. Let your work lead you and invent a new paradigm. You know, make up your own term. That's a very American thing to say, by the way. It's a very American thing to say, you know, do what you want to do. Very, very American. I hear that. Even a very Protestant, actually, to be honest, even a very Protestant thing to say. But some of you are nodding your heads here. Do you want to say a word about this in response to this question? Would you like to comment on this question?
Well, I mean, your response is great.
Yes. Yeah.
Dr. Hall, I did have one question to ask you. Just remind me one of the slide on the Madonna of 115th Street. Yeah, talking about how people they celebrate on the street, they move the statue of a virgin out of the church. I think this is some kind of sign to show because okay, I'm a Buddhist now, so but in my mind, any religion, not only Buddhism, I think any religion, the real meaning is for people they have something to learn, then to benefit it in their daily life. So right now, because in the United States, young people they just they just don't go to church anymore. I live there, I know. Yeah. So that means because why the young people they don't like to go to church on Sunday to study Bible or join some religious program anymore. I think the main reason is one of the reasons is because maybe we how to say religious people they take the word religion too serious sometimes, because when we're talking about religion, okay, I need to study the Bible or any Buddhist sutra and a lot of stuff. But for young people, they just want to do something to for them to kind of guide life to improve their life. So that's why Oprah, she's so famous. Because people they love to watch her instead go to church. You see, Oprah, she talk a lot so meaningful. I can take something to benefit my life, to improve my life quality. So I will go to Oprah instead go to my Father, my God. So this is a problem. I think it's a problem not only happen in the United States, because yeah, even people not a lot of young people go to, they come into the temple where I live in Pennsylvania. So I think maybe right now we're talking about sociology because we need to some kind of thinking outside of the box. Because if we put religion and any document, ancient sutra inside the box, but the box has some kind of limit. We cannot hope anybody to join the religion study. So I mean, maybe the world is changing and the society is changing as well. So
yeah, thank you so much there. I think this will have to be the. I think so. I'm going to respond with the two different sides of my head here. So, first of all, none of my children go to church, or my niece and nephew don't go to church, and for generations, people went to church. So I see this in my own family, and I can't think of a compelling reason to tell them why they must go to church. When I was a child, I was told there was hell, H-E-L-L, and that isn't very good. That's not, nobody talks about hell anymore. So. And then if you say, well, aren't you lonely, or how can you find satisfaction in buying or shopping, watching sports on television. If we say as a religious person, they say, well, I really like watching sports on television. You know, I mean, it's very, so Oprah does provide something for those people. But secondly, I'm going to go back to the point made about family formation. It's really the disruption in family structures that has allowed so many young people to float away. The notion of continuity in families. You know, in America, no one lives in the same town where their parents grew up. None of my children live where I live. No one lives in the same place. You say to someone, on a plane, I'm flying on a plane, I'm sitting next to somebody, what are you doing? I'm flying to California to see my grandchild. Very, very typical. Very, very typical American experience. And I'm flying to Taipei to see my granddaughter. So very, very typical American experience. So family cultures take on a different meaning, completely different meaning. It's like memory, it's like vicarious, it's like a vicarious family culture, to use Grace Davies' word. So religion is always part of culture. It's always part of the social. It's always being influenced by sharing so much with the cultural. It's not over here and that's over here. So, and then we feel change taking place at such a rapid pace. But one more comment here. A strict sociological answer to your question about why young people aren't going to church has to include their expectations for what they would find when they entered a church. So they expect churches to be peaceful places, protective places, places that are doing major good things, you know, for out there. And in Catholicism, as everyone in this room knows, in America, Catholicism turned out to be a place where children were abused, young people were abused. It's a disenchantment process that's set in. You know, I was told the church was this pure place. Turns out to be corrupt. And they have they're too young, they don't understand that corruption is everywhere. It's just, there's no pure place. There's no place of perfect purity. Try going to a faculty meeting. That's a laugh among insiders here. Some of you are not members of the faculty. Can I conclude with a joke? If my wife were here, she would say, don't tell me. Above all, she would say, don't tell any religious joke. So I won't tell a religious joke, I'll tell a faculty joke. I want to just say you've been a wonderful audience, and I hope to see some of you again tomorrow afternoon. I want to thank you. So the joke is, it's an American joke. Two men are leaving a faculty meeting. Two men, faculty meeting has come to an end, they're leaving. And one of these professors says to the other professor, when I die, I want to die back there, back in the faculty meeting. And his friend says, well, why would you want to die in a faculty meeting? Well, it's obvious. The transition from life to death is imperceptible. The transition from life to death happens without anyone noticing. It's imperceptible is a tough word here. Sorry. Translate.
We have a specialist here.
In other words, you know, it's terrible to explain a joke. You know your joke has failed. You have to explain the joke. So, the going from life to death happens all the time in the faculty meeting without anyone noticing it at all. So that's the point of the joke.
Everyone got it? Everyone got it? Okay. So let's thank Professor Hall again. And please allow me to remind all of you, there will be a roundtable discussion this afternoon right here from 2 to 4 p.m. So all of you are welcome, and please come join us later in the afternoon. So hope to see most of you this afternoon. And